They called it a joke, an agricultural tractor in steel clothing. When German armored divisions first crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, their officers laughed at the sight of Soviet tanks. They had grown used to superiority, sleek Panzers slicing through Poland, rolling across France in weeks. To them, the Red Army's armor looked crude, clumsy, and hopelessly outdated. But among those dismissed machines was one that would rewrite the mathematics of armored warfare. Its name was T-34. Within months, the same German officers who mocked it would be watching it roll over their burning Panzers and realizing too late that they had misjudged both the tank and the nation that built it. When Operation Barbarossa began, German planners believed the campaign would last 10 weeks. Soviet industry was underestimated, Soviet morale ignored, Soviet technology ridiculed. In the first days, Wehrmacht columns advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroying thousands of Red Army vehicles. Yet by late July 1941, reports began reaching Panzer Group headquarters describing a new type of enemy tank, one impervious to 37mm shells, one that could cross marshes and mud no German machine could follow. Commanders dismissed it as exaggeration. They had grown too confident in their blitzkrieg. The myth of German invincibility was about to be tested by cold steel and engineering genius hidden behind Soviet secrecy. Outside Minsk, the first confirmed encounter occurred. A Panzer III platoon under Lieutenant Hans Beck opened fire at a dark shape emerging through the smoke. Rounds ricocheted like hailstones off a roof. The Soviet tank rotated its turret with an unhurried motion and answered with a 76mm shell that blew Beck's lead tank apart in a blinding flash. "Armor too thick," his radio operator recorded before static consumed the frequency. By the end of the day, the Panzer III Company had been reduced to scrap, and German intelligence officers sent urgent requests to Berlin. Unknown medium tank, new threat. Immediate analysis required. That tank was the T-34, and it was only the beginning. To understand why it shocked the Wehrmacht, you must understand how the Soviets built it. Born from the ashes of the BT series fast tanks and the lessons of the Spanish Civil War, the T-34 was designed not for parades, but for survival in the worst conditions on Earth. Its designer, Mikhail Koshkin, insisted on three things: sloped armor to deflect shells, wide tracks for mud and snow, and a powerful diesel engine to keep it moving when others stalled. He drove his prototype from Kharkov to Moscow and back in the winter of 1940 to prove its endurance, arriving half-frozen but vindicated. When the war began, Soviet factories had just started mass production. By the time the Germans realized what they were facing, it was too late to stop the tide. The T-34 was a masterpiece of functional design. Its 45mm sloped armor gave it the effective protection of 80mm flat steel, enough to shrug off most German anti-tank guns in 1941. Its 76mm L-11 gun could destroy any Panzer at typical combat ranges. Its V2 diesel engine delivered 500 horsepower with half the fuel consumption of German gasoline engines, and its wide tracks let it glide through the mud that swallowed German vehicles whole. But its greatest strength was simplicity. It was easy to produce, easy to repair, and forgiving of rough treatment. German engineers would later study captured T-34s and admit through gritted teeth that the design was superior in every way that mattered in war. Autumn 1941 turned the Eastern Front into a graveyard of machines. Rain turned roads to swamps, and panzers bogged down in mud, while T-34s rolled past them like ghosts. German infantrymen watched in horror as Soviet tanks appeared from the mist, firing on the move, crushing guns beneath their tracks. Major General Heinz Guderian, father of the Panzer doctrine itself, confessed in his journal that the new Soviet tanks had nullified his entire concept of armored warfare. "Against them," he wrote, "our guns are powerless beyond 50 meters." The Panzer III and IV, kings of the battlefield in France, were suddenly obsolete. The invincible Wehrmacht had met its equal and did not know how to adapt. Outside Moscow, in the winter of 1941–42, the T-34 became a symbol of resistance. While German machines froze solid in temperatures below -30, the Soviet diesels roared to life. Crews lit fires under German engines to warm them. T-34 crews simply turned the key. A single T-34 of the 107th Tank Division famously held off a column of 20 Panzers for several hours, its armor pitted and scorched but unbroken. German infantry reported nightmares of hearing tracks in the dark, believing T-34s could move through any terrain at will. It was not fear of technology alone. It was fear of the idea that the enemy had built something better. By 1942, captured T-34s were shipped to Germany for testing at Kummersdorf. The results stunned engineers. They discovered that the Soviets had achieved reliability and mobility through clever engineering, not luck. The transmission, the suspension, even the armor angle were products of hard science and ruthless field testing. One report to the Ordnance Office read, "The T-34 is the best tank in the world." Hitler was furious. He ordered a response, the Panther. But where the T-34 was born of simplicity, the Panther was born of ego. An over-engineered, complex machine that would break down as often as it fought. The Soviets had already won the war of production philosophy. As Germany designed new tanks, the Soviets moved their factories east. Entire industrial cities, Kirov, Chelyabinsk, Magnitogorsk, rose in the Urals. Trains carried machines and workers through bombed rail lines, through snowstorms and starvation. They set up production lines in barns, warehouses, open fields. Women, teenagers and old men worked around the clock, welding and riveting by hand. By 1942, Soviet factories were producing 1,200 T-34s per month, double the total number of Panzers Germany could field at the front. Quantity became quality. Where Germany built masterpieces, the Soviets built an army of machines that would bury them. When the Battle of Stalingrad began, the T-34 was everywhere. They roared through the streets, crashing through walls, firing at point-blank range. German troops nicknamed them Ratsch Bum for the sound of incoming shells that followed too quickly to dodge. Inside those tanks were crews barely out of their teens, driving machines that seemed to have a soul of their own. One German memoir from the 6th Army described a scene where a T-34, engulfed in flames, continued charging until it rammed a Panzer IV, destroying both. "Madness," he wrote, but mechanized madness that we could not stop. By the time the Germans surrendered in Stalingrad, their legend of superiority had burned to ashes alongside their tanks. 1943 brought Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Hitler promised a decisive counterblow with his new Panthers and Tigers. Nearly 3,000 German tanks charged into a fortress of 7,000 Soviet machines, most of them T-34s. For a week, the fields of Prokhorovka burned. Observers described the sky black with smoke, the earth shaking with thousands of engines. The T-34s fought like a swarm of hornets, fast, agile, and everywhere at once. German tanks were superior individually, but they were outnumbered 3-1, and every breakdown was fatal. The Tigers and Panthers became beacons for artillery fire. Their thick armor turned into a trap. When the dust cleared, the German armored corps was in ruins. The T-34 had not just survived, it had triumphed. From then on, the Red Army never lost the initiative. What made the T-34 unstoppable was not just its armor or gun, but its spirit of mass mobilization. Every part of the Soviet Union contributed. Factories in Siberia cast turrets through the night. Schools trained girls as welders and machinists. Poets wrote odes to the tank that defended the motherland. Even its paint was optimized for speed, green pigment mixed with petrol and slapped on by hand as the engine warmed for combat trials. This was production as warfare, and it crushed the precision-obsessed German machine state. By 1944, for every Panther leaving a German factory, 5 T-34s rolled out of Soviet ones. By war's end, over 57,000 T-34s had been built. It was not just a tank, it was a movement of metal and resolve. On the front lines, German commanders learned humility the hard way. Oberst Karl-Heinz Lange of the 9th Panzer Division wrote after Kursk, "The T-34 was the perfect tank for Russia. It could be forged in hell and still keep fighting." His own unit lost half its strength in 2 days to flanking maneuvers by T-34 crews who used speed instead of armor to win. The Germans called them phantoms. They appeared from forest edges, fired, and vanished before counterfire could reach them. The psychological effect was devastating. For the first time, German tank crews felt what the French and Poles had felt in 1940: helplessness. Inside the T-34, conditions were brutal. No radios in early models, little ventilation, and a cramped space barely fit for 4 men. But the crews bonded with their machines. They named them after wives, villages, and fallen friends. They painted slogans on the hulls: "Za Rodinu," for the motherland; "Za Stalina," for Stalin. Superstition mixed with steel, and in those claustrophobic tombs of metal, they fought with a fervor no training manual could teach. German soldiers later testified that Soviet tankers seemed immune to fear, perhaps because they knew what defeat meant. As the war dragged into its final years, the T-34 evolved. The T-34/85 arrived in 1944, mounting an 85mm gun capable of piercing a Tiger's front armor at 1,000 meters. It gave the Red Army a weapon to match any tank in the world, but it also symbolized how quickly Soviet industry could adapt. Factories retooled in weeks. The new turret was larger, the gun longer, the armor thicker, but the philosophy unchanged. Keep it simple, keep it reliable, build it by the thousands. When the Red Army crossed the Vistula in 1945, the sky glowed red from the exhausts of hundreds of T-34s rolling through the Polish countryside, an endless procession of steel and determination. Civilians lined the roads, watching the armored river flow westward, astonished by the scale. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the synchronized thunder of tracks. The tanks were no longer symbols of survival. They were instruments of vengeance. Every field of wrecked Panzers testified to the reversal of fortune. The same commanders who had once laughed at Soviet design now whispered orders in fear whenever the rumble of distant engines reached their trenches. The T-34 had become more than a weapon. It was a prophecy fulfilled in diesel and iron. By early 1945, German armor officers spoke of it with awe, even respect. Major Erwin Schneider of the Großdeutschland Division admitted that every destroyed T-34 seemed to be replaced by 3 more. Their attacks felt endless, mechanical, and inevitable. The Wehrmacht had entered the war believing engineering elegance would guarantee victory. The T-34 proved that perfection on paper meant nothing if it couldn't be made by the tens of thousands. Each Soviet tank that appeared on the horizon represented not just steel and gunpowder, but a supply line stretching across a continent, an army of workers, and a national will that refused to die. German field reports began using a new phrase, T-34 terror. to describe the psychological fatigue of fighting something that seemed immortal. At the Battle of Budapest, T-34s forced their way through narrow streets built centuries before automobiles existed. German anti-tank guns knocked one out, then another, but the Soviets simply drove over their fallen comrades, using burning wrecks as cover. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "They move as if the fire feeds them." In the frozen outskirts, Panther crews found themselves surrounded not by infantry, but by T-34s driving in circles, shells bursting on every side. When their engines failed, the Germans abandoned their tanks and fled on foot. Their own creations, masterpieces of engineering, had become liabilities, while the crude Soviet machines endured. The secret lay in Soviet pragmatism. Where German tank crews required specialized mechanics for every fault, Soviet crews carried wrenches, hammers, and spare parts bolted to the hull. They repaired transmissions under fire. They replaced track links with pieces of wood if steel was gone. A crippled T-34 could be back in the fight in hours, while a broken Tiger might take days to recover, if a recovery vehicle even survived to reach it. Logistics won wars, and the T-34 turned logistics into a weapon. Simplicity became deadlier than sophistication. German engineers knew it too. Captured T-34s were reverse-engineered, studied, and even used in combat. They tried copying its sloped armor for the Panther, its wide tracks for the Tiger II, but they couldn't replicate the secret ingredient, the ability to mass-produce without sacrificing reliability. Soviet factories built tanks like bread. Each assembly line was brutal in efficiency. The workers lived beside their machines, sleeping on floors between shifts. They ate whatever was available, black bread, cabbage soup, and kept welding. Every spark that flew from their torches was a weapon aimed westward. In February 1945, when the Red Army reached the Oder River, thousands of T-34s lined the eastern bank. The bridges had been destroyed, but the Soviets improvised floating pontoons. Engineers lashed logs and barrels together, coating them in pitch, while tank crews waited, smoking in silence. One by one, the machines rolled forward, water rising over their tracks, diesel exhaust spraying white mist into the winter air. German sentries on the far shore opened fire, but it didn't matter. The tanks kept coming, crawling across like prehistoric beasts emerging from the deep. When the first T-34 reached the western bank, the soldiers inside cheered through choking smoke. The invasion of Germany had begun. The final chapters of the war turned the T-34 into myth. In Silesia, it punched through minefields so dense that entire battalions vanished in fire. In East Prussia, it crashed through forests that had never seen vehicles, following tracks of frozen mud and shattered trees. And in Berlin, it became the hammer that broke the Reich. On April 21, 1945, T-34s of the 1st Belarusian Front crossed the city limits. They fired down the avenues of what had once been the Nazi capital, blasting through barricades of rubble and twisted tramcars. Each explosion echoed like a verdict. German civilians watched from cellars as the tanks they once mocked reduced their empire to dust. Inside the city, resistance crumbled. The mighty Tiger IIs that had once inspired terror now stood immobilized, out of fuel, their thick armor useless without mobility. T-34s surrounded them in packs, circling and firing until even the heaviest German machines were torn apart. On April 30th, as Soviet soldiers stormed the Reichstag, T-34s parked in its shadow like sentinels. The war had come full circle. The tank that the Germans once dismissed as crude had crushed the architects of its ridicule beneath its treads. When peace returned, the T-34's legend only grew. It became the most produced tank in human history, over 57,000 built during the war, tens of thousands more afterward. It fought in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa. Nations rebuilt their armies around it. Its silhouette became a symbol of liberation to some, occupation to others, but always power. German officers who survived the Eastern Front wrote memoirs filled with grudging respect. General Hasso von Manteuffel called it the deadliest opponent we faced. Even Western analysts later admitted that without the T-34, the Red Army might have collapsed in 1941. It was more than steel. It was the embodiment of endurance. But behind its triumph lay tragedy. The T-34's simplicity also meant vulnerability. Thousands were destroyed. Tens of thousands of crewmen never returned. The inside of the turret was a coffin lined with metal. If penetrated, spalling fragments would turn it into a blender of flesh and fire. Crews knew their life expectancy was minutes in combat, yet they climbed in anyway. For every T-34 that survived, several others burned. The Soviets accepted that price. To them, victory justified everything. The tank was not designed to save lives. It was designed to win wars. And it did. Post-war historians often debate whether the T-34 was truly superior to its German rivals. The answer depends on the battlefield you choose. In a museum, the Panther looks more elegant. On a field of mud, the T-34 was king. It combined enough armor, enough firepower, and enough mobility to overwhelm any opposition when multiplied by thousands. It wasn't perfect. It was unstoppable. The Germans built machines that demanded care. The Soviets built machines that demanded courage. And courage, multiplied by millions, was a force no engineer could design against. Even American observers were astonished. When the U.S. Army tested captured T-34s after the war, they concluded that no Western tank of 1941 could have matched it. The sloped armor concept was adopted universally. Its influence can be traced through every modern tank, from the M48 Patton to the M1 Abrams. The T-34 reshaped global doctrine. It proved that efficiency, not extravagance, wins wars, and its legacy echoed long after Berlin fell silent. In Germany's own reconstruction, memories of the T-34 lingered. Former Wehrmacht officers teaching in West German academies used it as a cautionary example. They told young cadets, "Never underestimate an opponent's capacity to innovate under pressure. Never believe propaganda over observation." For many, the image of a T-34 emerging from the mist remained the moment they realized the war was lost. It wasn't the Red Army's numbers or Stalin's will. It was the machine itself, proof that Soviet industry could achieve miracles under fire. For the men who had fought against it, the memories were personal. In post-war interviews, German tank commanders spoke of the first time they saw one. "We thought it was a joke," one said, "until it fired back." Another recalled how the ground shook before they even saw it. Others admitted that by 1943, hearing its engine sent them into panic. The sound of its diesel was unlike anything else, deep, rolling, implacable. It wasn't just noise, it was destiny approaching on treads. The Soviet veterans who crewed it remembered something different. They spoke of sleeping beneath its hull for warmth, of painting slogans in chalk before battle, of singing as they charged into smoke. For them, the T-34 was both shield and tomb. When asked why they kept fighting despite the odds, one gunner said simply, "Because it kept moving." That phrase became the unwritten motto of the Eastern Front. The tank that kept moving when everything else stopped. In 1945, as the last Panzers burned, German intelligence compiled a final report on Soviet armor. It concluded with a single line: "The T-34 is the decisive weapon of the Eastern Front." It was an admission born not of admiration, but defeat. From that moment, the myth of German invincibility died. No amount of propaganda could erase what soldiers had seen with their own eyes, an enemy that had outthought, outbuilt, and outlasted them. Decades later, in military academies across the world, students still study its design. Its blueprints are lessons in balance, armor versus weight, simplicity versus strength. Museums preserve them in rows, their paint faded, their turrets turned slightly askew as if still scanning the horizon. Children climb on them during parades. Veterans place flowers on their hulls. Nations that once feared them now display them as history's teachers. Time has turned the war's deadliest weapon into a monument. The irony is timeless. The Germans, masters of mechanical precision, dismissed the T-34 as crude and were destroyed by it. The Soviets, mocked for backwardness, produced a tank so advanced in concept that it redefined warfare. The lesson endures in every factory and battlefield since. Underestimate simplicity at your peril. The T-34 didn't win through perfection. It won because it worked, everywhere, always. Its story is the story of industrial war itself. How nations survive not through brilliance alone, but through adaptability, endurance, and will. The Germans fought for ideology. The Soviets fought for existence. Between them rolled a machine that symbolized the latter's resolve. It was loud, hot, uncomfortable, and lethal. It burned through men and fuel alike, but it never stopped. And in that unstoppable momentum lay the secret to victory. When the Red Army paraded through Berlin after the war, T-34s led the columns. Their tracks clattered over the stones of Unter den Linden, past the ruins of ministries that once plotted world domination. Children climbed lampposts to watch, and the veterans saluted as if greeting an old comrade. The tank that had defended Moscow now conquered the capital of its enemy. The irony was complete, and history, for once, had a sense of poetic justice. For years after the war, rusted T-34s remained scattered across Europe, half buried in fields, abandoned in forests, monuments of metal where the world's greatest armies had collided. Farmers ploughed around them, children played on them, and historians, decades later, would trace the rise and fall of empires through their tracks. Each dent, each weld, each faded star told a story of a world that learned the hard way that arrogance dies faster than steel. The T-34 was not a miracle of technology. It was a miracle of humanity's refusal to yield. It was born in factories under siege, built by hands trembling from cold and hunger, driven by men and women who had nothing left to lose. And yet it changed the course of the 20th century. The Germans scoffed at it because they could not imagine that something so simple, so brutal, so practical could defeat them. But it did. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Red Army stood atop a continent in ruins. Its tanks had carried it from the Volga to the Elbe, through ash, mud, and ice. Yet even amid celebration, Soviet engineers knew that victory was not the end of innovation. It was merely an intermission. The T-34 had conquered Europe, but already its own creators were dismantling it, studying its weaknesses and planning its successor. Because in the Soviet mind, war never truly ended. It only changed shape. Again and again, from the fields of Smolensk to the streets of Berlin, it rolled forward until there was nothing left to stop it. When the last shots of the war faded, when the smoke cleared and Europe lay in ruins, the T-34 stood as both symbol and survivor. It had crushed fascism beneath its treads and carried the hopes of a battered nation into history. For the Germans, it was a nightmare they could never escape. For the Soviets, it was the face of victory. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that power is not always polished, that sometimes the ugliest machine wins because it refuses to break. In the end, The T-34 was more than a tank. It was proof that innovation born from desperation can change the world. It rolled through mud, fire, and blood. It outlasted its creators and outlived its enemies. Its steel faded, but its legend did not. The Nazi commanders who once scoffed at it learned too late that the machine they mocked was the one that would bury their empire. The sound of its engine was the sound of history moving forward, relentless, unstoppable, and utterly indifferent to arrogance. And when the world remembers the Eastern Front, it remembers that sound, the growl of diesel, the clatter of tracks, the echo of defiance rolling across the steppe. The sound of a tank that refused to stop. The sound of the T-34. Factories that had been relocated eastward during the war were now returning west, bringing with them the ghosts of production lines that had saved a nation. Kharkov, Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, the beating hearts of Soviet armor, were being rebuilt at impossible speed. The same workers who had once welded armor plates by lantern light now walked through vast workshops illuminated by rows of electric lamps. The Soviets had mastered something Germany never had: industrial mobilization as a way of life. Every assembly line was a military front, every engineer a soldier, every machine a potential weapon. The T-34's blueprints hung on the walls like holy scripture, but beside them were new sketches. Tanks with lower silhouettes, thicker armor, smoother turrets. The great patriotic war had revealed lessons written in blood. The T-34 had been revolutionary, but it was also a creature of compromise. Its sloped armor had saved countless lives, yet its crew space was cramped. Its speed was unmatched, yet its transmission was fragile. Its gun had ruled 1941, but by 1945, even German infantry carried weapons that could threaten it. The next generation had to be better. In 1946, the design bureaus received a new directive from the Kremlin. It was brief, almost ascetic in tone. Create a new tank. It must outlast any enemy. It must be simple to build, but impossible to destroy. The man chosen to oversee this transformation was Alexander Morozov, the same engineer who had guided the T-34 through its final wartime evolutions. His new design would not just replace the T-34, it would embody everything the Soviet Union had learned about survival. Morozov began with a principle learned the hard way at Stalingrad: a tank that cannot be maintained in the field is already dead. The T-34 had proven the power of simplicity, so he made simplicity sacred. Fewer parts, fewer tools, fewer systems that could fail. He redesigned the transmission for durability, widened the suspension for smoother movement, and built a new turret ring that could house a larger gun. The goal was not elegance, but endurance. By 1947, prototypes were rolling off test tracks in Nizhny Tagil. At first glance, they looked like descendants of the T-34, low, sloped, purposeful. But closer inspection revealed a leap forward. The armor was thicker, welded at sharper angles, forming a nearly impenetrable dome. The gun was a new 100mm D-10T cannon, capable of punching through any Western tank at a kilometer. The engine was more powerful, the crew positions more ergonomic, the tracks broader still. This machine would become the T-54, the heir to a legend. When the first Western observers caught sight of it during the late 1940s, they called it the ghost tank. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, replacing the T-34 in garrisons and parades with astonishing speed. In reality, the transition had been deliberate and methodical. Soviet industry had become a perpetual motion system. The same foundries that once forged the T-34's armor now poured steel for the T-54s without pause. The workers barely noticed the change. To them, building tanks was as routine as baking bread. The Soviet leadership understood the psychological power of visibility. The T-34 was paraded through Red Square long before it reached full production. Cameras flashed, foreign attachés took notes, and the message was unmistakable. The Red Army had not only won the war, it had mastered its machinery. Western analysts stared at photographs, tracing the contours of the turret, estimating thickness, comparing silhouettes. They concluded with unease that the Soviets were now the most experienced tank builders in the world, yet the T-34 never vanished. It remained the skeleton beneath the new armor, the DNA encoded in every Soviet vehicle. In training camps from the Carpathians to Vladivostok, old T-34s became classrooms. Cadets learned gunnery on their turrets, maintenance on their engines, and discipline under their weight. A generation of soldiers was raised beneath their steel shadows. The tank that had crushed fascism now trained the army that would confront the West. Inside Soviet factories, efficiency became ideology. Managers quoted production statistics as if they were scripture. In 1949, plant number 183 in Nizhny Tagil produced 1,800 T-54s, almost twice the output of all British tank plants combined. The Soviet Union had achieved something new: industrial totalitarianism, where every citizen's labor fed into a single mechanical organism. The war had forged a machine state, and tanks were its language. The engineers who built them were revered like generals. Alexander Morozov received the Stalin Prize, the highest honor of Soviet science. Yet even as he celebrated, he was already thinking ahead. Western intelligence had reported the arrival of the American M46 Patton, and whispers circulated about a British heavy tank with monstrous armor, the Centurion. Morozov knew the cycle of innovation never stopped. If the T-54 was the son of the T-34, its grandson had to be stronger still. The next evolution came quietly. The Soviet Union was entering the nuclear age, and its tanks had to survive in a world where the sky itself could burn. The Design Bureau began work on the T-55, a modification that would make history. It carried improved NBC nuclear, biological, chemical protection, automatic fire suppression, and a sealed fighting compartment. Its silhouette was even lower, its reliability unmatched. In trials, it ran for 2,000 kilometers without a major failure, something no Western tank of the time could achieve. But what truly made the T-55 revolutionary was scale. Between 1958 and 1981, over 50,000 units rolled out of Soviet and Warsaw Pact factories. It was the T-34 reborn for a new era. Wherever Soviet influence reached, so did its tanks. Egypt, Syria, Vietnam, Cuba, Angola, all received the steel descendants of Stalingrad. They became the symbols of revolution, the muscle behind ideology. To the world, the T-55 was communism on tracks. The manufacturing miracle behind it defied Western imagination. Soviet plants operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Steel arrived in the morning, was shaped by noon, welded by midnight, and painted by dawn. Women operated cranes, men supervised furnaces, apprentices measured armor plates with calipers older than themselves. The rhythm was relentless. During one inspection in 1961, a Western reporter visiting Poland's Bumar-Łabędy plant remarked that the workers moved like parts of a living engine. They were not building tanks, he wrote. They were tanks. Morozov himself remained a paradox. A man who despised war, yet built the machines that made it possible. When asked once what made the T-34 and T-54 successful, he replied, "We built for soldiers, not engineers." His philosophy guided the entire Soviet design tradition. Western tanks grew heavier, more complex, and more dependent on electronics. Soviet tanks remained lean, lethal, and expendable. In NATO circles, This philosophy was terrifying. It meant that if war ever came again, the Warsaw Pact could flood Europe with armor faster than it could be destroyed. Inside Soviet testing grounds, the experiments never stopped. At Kubinka, engineers drove prototypes until their engines caught fire, measuring the temperature of gearboxes as they melted. At Chelyabinsk, they fired shells into the sides of obsolete models just to observe how the welds behaved. Every destroyed hull was a lesson. The Soviet Union believed that perfection required sacrifice of machines, materials, and occasionally men. Meanwhile, thousands of old T-34s were refurbished for export. The tank that had once battled the Wehrmacht now fought in Korea, defending North Korean lines against UN forces. American soldiers who had grown up hearing about the T-34's legend found themselves facing it in real life. In one after-action report from 1951, a U.S. Marine described a column of T-34s advancing through fog near Seoul. They came on slow, deliberate, like ghosts in steel. Even after a decade, the machines still inspired fear. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union was producing tanks faster than any nation in history. The T-55 had become so ubiquitous that NATO developed entire doctrines around defeating it. Western designers built the Centurion Mk5, the M48 Patton, and eventually the M60, all to counter a tank whose conceptual roots traced back to 1939. In this arms race, the T-34's legacy guided every move. It had established the blueprint, combined mobility, armor, and production efficiency into one weapon of mass endurance. Inside the Kremlin, the tank had become a symbol of national prestige. Each May Day parade featured columns of them, polished and gleaming under the Moscow sun. The crowd roared as they passed, their tracks clanking on cobblestones, their crews saluting the party elite. It was theater, but also a reminder to both citizens and enemies that the Soviet Union's strength was measurable not just in ideology, but in tonnage. In training schools, Soviet officers taught new recruits the gospel of reliability. They showed them how to fix a transmission with a hammer, how to keep the diesel warm in Arctic cold, how to fire while on the move. The T-55 was not designed for luxury. It was designed for persistence. Manuals emphasized endurance over elegance, discipline over comfort. The men who learned within its steel walls would go on to command the armored divisions that defined the Cold War balance. By the mid-1960s, the design lineage had already begun evolving again. The T-62 introduced a smoothbore 115mm gun, the first of its kind, a direct descendant of lessons learned from the T-34's balance of firepower and mobility. Later, still came the T-72, the T-80, and finally the T-90. Each inherited the same bloodline: sloped armor, compact profile, rugged mechanics, and above all, the obsession with simplicity. If you strip a modern Russian tank to its frame, you can still see the ghost of the T-34 staring back. Western analysts often struggled to grasp this continuity. They measured progress in electronics, optics, and comfort. The Soviets measured it in kilometers traveled before failure. To them, a tank was not a showroom piece. It was an anvil. It existed to absorb punishment, to keep moving, to outlast. That philosophy came directly from the war years, from frozen fields where survival meant more than precision. The T-34 had taught them that a weapon's true genius lies not in perfection, but in persistence. In 1967, when Israel's Centurions and Pattons faced Egyptian T-54s and T-55s in the Six-Day War, the world saw the first clash of post-war tank philosophies. The Israelis, using Western precision and superior training, destroyed hundreds of Arab tanks. Yet even as wrecks burned across Sinai, Soviet advisors took notes. They learned, adapted, improved. By the 1973 Yom Kippur War, upgraded T-55s and T-62s exacted a fearsome toll. It was the T-34's doctrine all over again. Lose machines, not battles. Replace them faster than the enemy can respond. In factories across the Soviet bloc, production lines continued like arteries of a single body. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany all manufactured T-50s and T-55s under license. Each factory became a fortress of industry, feeding a global network of allies. The tank that had begun as a symbol of survival now became a currency of influence. From Havana to Hanoi, its arrival signified that Moscow's hand had reached another shore. Engineers back in Kharkov sometimes joked that the T-34 had never truly died. It had merely changed its name. When they walked through the assembly halls, they could trace the lineage with a glance. The same slope of the glacis, the same hum of the diesel, the same smell of oil and paint. Time had moved forward, but the essence remained. They were still building the weapon that had saved them from extinction, only now with thicker armor and a bigger gun. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of victory over Germany, veterans gathered in Red Square. Among them stood Morozov, older, slower, but still sharp-eyed. As T-55s and T-62s rumbled past, he turned to a young officer and said quietly, "They are all my children." The officer laughed, thinking it was a joke. It was not. Every tank that passed bore some fragment of his design, a suspension spring, a turret contour, a layout philosophy. Morozov had become the father of modern armored warfare, though he would never claim the title. When he died in 1979, the Soviet Union buried him with full honors. His coffin was draped not in flowers, but in steel. A miniature model of the T-34 rested atop it, symbolizing both his creation and his burden. By then, the T-55 had served in over 40 nations and fought in every major conflict since 1945. Its echo was global. The post-war Soviet industrial machine that produced it had become one of the largest systems of mass production in human history. Entire cities existed solely to feed its appetite. Magnitogorsk for steel, Nizhny Tagil for assembly, Omsk for engines. The process was so vast that it blurred the line between peace and war. Even in peacetime, the factories roared. The tank had become the heartbeat of the nation. Western economists struggled to comprehend how the Soviet Union sustained such output. The answer lay in mindset. The Soviets had turned wartime mobilization into permanent infrastructure. They did not demobilize, they redirected. Every rivet was an act of faith, every welding spark a hymn to resilience. The T-34 had taught them that survival through production was possible, and they never forgot. As the Cold War reached its height, the philosophy that began with the T-34 shaped an empire's destiny. The tank had once rolled through Berlin. Now its descendants sat in forests of Eastern Europe, engines idling, waiting for a war that never came. Each represented not just firepower, but continuity, the living proof that the Soviet state could outbuild and outlast any rival. And so, in the decades after the Reich fell, the true legacy of the T-34 was not only in the battles it won, but in the factories it inspired, the doctrines it shaped, and the generations it molded. The war had ended, but its echo continued in steel. The ghosts of Stalingrad now wore new names, T-54, T-55, T-62, but their spirit was the same. They were children of necessity, born from a nation that refused to kneel. The West built tanks to win battles. The Soviets built tanks to survive centuries, and through that relentless pragmatism, the soul of the T-34 lived on, rumbling through the smoke of foundries, glinting under parades, waiting, as it always had, for history to demand its return. By the dawn of the 1960s, the T-34's grandchildren had crossed every border on Earth. They rolled down Red Square in celebration, across deserts in silence, and through jungles in fury. The T-55 and its elder sibling, the T-54, became not just tanks, but ambassadors of an idea: that power could be mass-produced, exported, and endlessly renewed. The Soviet Union no longer needed to conquer Europe with armies. It could do it with shipments of steel. Ships left Odessa and Murmansk stacked with crates marked agricultural equipment, though everyone knew what they carried. Beneath the canvas tarps and customs seals lay disassembled tanks, ready to be reborn in faraway lands. Within months, T-50s were rumbling through the streets of Cairo, Damascus, Hanoi, and Havana. Soviet advisors called them the children of the steppe. Western intelligence gave them another name: the Red Flood. In Egypt, they became the backbone of Nasser's armored divisions. In Syria, they lined the Golan Heights like sleeping giants. In Vietnam, they crawled through the jungle on roads built from crushed bamboo. And in Cuba, they guarded beaches against invasions that never came. Wherever revolutionary governments took power, the T-55 arrived soon after, its red star painted over with a new flag, but its soul unchanged. It was the physical embodiment of Soviet influence, heavy, reliable, and everywhere at once. Wars that might once have been fought with rifles were now fought with armor. The Six-Day War of 1967 turned Sinai into a graveyard of T-55s, but their loss only multiplied production. Each destroyed tank became justification for 10 more. By 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched their counteroffensive during the Yom Kippur War, the sands shook with the thunder of over 2,000 Soviet tanks advancing at once. Israeli pilots described the scene as a moving continent of armor. For hours, the desert burned. Even when the Israelis' superior tactics prevailed, they could not deny the scale. They realized what the Germans had learned 3 decades earlier. You can destroy tanks, but you cannot destroy an idea that can build them faster than you can burn them. In Africa, the T-55 became a tool of liberation and control. Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia all received their steel inheritance through Soviet or Cuban hands. On the savannah, they fought wars far removed from the icy logic of Europe. Dust choked their engines, tropical rains rusted their hulls, but still they moved. In Angola's long civil war, columns of T-55s battled across plains so vast that entire squadrons vanished into the horizon. Decades after the Second World War, farmers still found the tracks of these machines embedded in the soil, fossilized footprints of ideology. In Asia, the story repeated. North Vietnam's armored brigades, trained by Soviet advisors, used T-54s and T-55s to spearhead the final assaults of 1975. When Saigon fell, a T-54 burst through the gates of the presidential palace, the same silhouette that had once crashed through the Reichstag's doors. History, it seemed, had a strange sense of symmetry. From Berlin to Saigon, the Soviet design had marked both the beginning and the end of empires. To Western strategists, the proliferation of these tanks was terrifying. NATO war planners estimated that, in the event of a European conflict, the Warsaw Pact could field over 40,000 tanks within weeks, half of them T-55s. Intelligence reports from the 1970s warned that the roads of East Germany and Poland were strong enough to support a tidal wave of armor moving west. Every exercise in the Fulda Gap ended with the same conclusion. The first days of any war would be a storm of T-55s. The alliance's entire strategy, Its aircraft, its missiles, its nuclear doctrine evolved in reaction to this one machine and its offspring. And yet, for all their numbers, the tanks were more than weapons. They were propaganda in motion. Soviet films showed them crossing rivers, cresting hills, framed against the rising sun. They were the heroes of a mechanized mythology. To a Soviet worker watching from a cramped apartment in Minsk or Leningrad, each parade on television was proof that their labor had meaning. The same machine that once saved their fathers from the Wehrmacht now guarded their children from capitalism. It was reassurance cast in iron, but steel, like ideology, rusts. By the 1980s, the T-55 was aging. New Western tanks, the Leopard 2, the Challenger, the M1 Abrams, outclassed it in every measurable way. Their fire control systems could target on the move. Their composite armor could shrug off the T-55's 100mm shells, and their sensors turned night into day. Yet in the Third World, where simplicity mattered more than sophistication, the T-55 reigned supreme. Nations without the infrastructure to maintain modern machines still found comfort in its diesel growl. Its design was timeless because it accepted imperfection as strength. It was not the best tank in the world, it was the most practical. In 1980, during the Iran-Iraq War, both sides fielded Soviet T-55s and T-60s. It was a grim irony. The same machine built to defend socialism now killed socialists and nationalists alike. On the plains of Khuzestan, tanks of identical origin met head-on, their crews shouting in different languages, their shells made from the same Soviet steel. The T-55 had become globalized violence, a weapon detached from ideology. It no longer served a flag.